The grandfather clock in Ashford Manor's entrance hall had just struck midnight on Christmas Eve when the screaming began. Margaret Ashford, wife of the textile magnate Sir Edmund Ashford, stood frozen in the library doorway, her silver gown glowing like moonlight against the mahogany panelling. Her trembling finger pointed toward the safe concealed behind a portrait of the 3rd Earl of Ashford. The portrait still hung perfectly straight, yet the safe door gaped open like the mouth of some astonished creature. Gone. The entire contents of the Ashford jewels, accumulated across 3 generations, had vanished without a trace. Detective Inspector Waverley arrived within the hour, snow still clinging to his overcoat like accusations. He surveyed the scene with practised scepticism, his weathered face growing increasingly perplexed. The Manor's security was impeccable by 1930s standards. The safe required a key and a combination known only to Sir Edmund and his wife. No windows had been forced. The servants reported hearing nothing unusual until Margaret's discovery at midnight. The footprints in the snow outside revealed nothing. Christmas Eve weather had dusted the grounds with fresh powder, untouched save for the groundskeeper's early morning rounds. Yet there, scattered across the mahogany desk beside the open safe, lay a collection of objects that made no sense whatsoever. A single playing card, the Queen of Hearts, deliberately placed face up. A child's wooden toy soldier, painted in gaudy red and gold. A pair of spectacles with one lens missing. A Christmas cracker, its paper wrapping half unwound. A stub of a railway ticket to London, dated 3 days prior. Meaningless, declared Inspector Waverley, studying each item with growing frustration. Unless our thief has become a collector of rubbish. Sir Edmund, his face purple with rage and wounded pride, paced the library like a caged animal. His guests, 15 of them in total staying for the holiday celebrations, had already been assembled in the drawing room. Among them were his nephew Frederick, a gambling man with considerable debts, his brother-in-law Victor, recently returned from India with expensive tastes and thin finances, the family solicitor Mr. Pemberton, whose personal fortune had mysteriously evaporated that very autumn, and a selection of old family friends, each with their own secrets, carefully buried beneath festive cheer and seasonal courtesy. "This is an inside job," Margaret insisted, her voice steady now despite her earlier hysteria. The killer, no, the thief, they knew about the safe. They knew the combination. But the combination had been changed only 1 week prior, known exclusively to Sir Edmund and Margaret. Inspector Waverley had already questioned both thoroughly. Neither could have acted alone, yet neither would betray the other. The possibility of collusion seemed remote, though not impossible. The mystery deepened when the inspector discovered that 3 servants had called in sick that very day, an unusual occurrence for Christmas Eve. Their addresses proved to be false. A thorough search of the manor revealed fresh mud on the study floor, inconsistent with either the kitchen entrance or the main doors. Somewhere, somehow, a thief had moved through this locked house as though its walls held no substance. Then came the peculiar detail that haunted the investigation. Every guest in the manor reported hearing footsteps in the corridor between 11 and midnight. Yet no one could describe them accurately. Some swore they were hurried. Others insisted they were leisurely. One guest, the elderly Miss Hartley, claimed to have seen a figure in a red coat ascending the main staircase. Yet no one owned such a coat. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, the stolen jewels remained missing. The safe empty of answers, and the scattered objects on the desk offered nothing but cryptic silence. It was precisely at 8 o'clock on Christmas morning, as the manor's occupants were reluctantly gathering for a subdued breakfast, that the telegram arrived. Inspector Waverley read it with visible relief, though not unmixed with apprehension. Hercule Poirot, the celebrated Belgian detective who maintained a quiet residence in the English countryside, had been contacted by wire the previous evening through official channels. He would arrive within the hour. When the little man emerged from the motor car, brushing snow from his immaculate overcoat with fastidious precision, he seemed almost comically out of place against the Gothic grandeur of Ashford Manor. His moustache, waxed to perfect points, caught the winter sunlight like twin crescents of vanity, yet his eyes, sharp, penetrating, missing nothing, swept across the assembled scene with the thoroughness of a surgeon's scalpel. Poirot's first action was not to examine the safe, nor to question the family. Instead, he walked directly to the mahogany desk and studied the scattered objects with his hands clasped behind his back, leaning so close that his moustache nearly touched the Queen of Hearts. He remained there for a full 5 minutes, occasionally tilting his head like a bird contemplating a particularly interesting insect. The sequence matters, he murmured to himself, his accent rolling the words like smooth river stones. But which sequence, mon Dieu? Inspector Waverley, standing nearby with evident impatience, cleared his throat. "We've photographed everything, Mr. Poirot. The objects appear to be deliberate misdirection, perhaps the work of someone attempting to confuse the investigation." Poirot straightened, his eyes twinkling with something between amusement and intensity. But you see, Inspector, you have assumed that confusion is the purpose. What if clarity is hidden beneath apparent chaos? Tell me, who discovered these items precisely as they lie now?" "Mrs. Ashford, the victim's wife," Waverley replied, flipping through his notebook. "She found them at midnight, when she discovered the open safe." "And she disturbed nothing? She merely observed and screamed?" "She claims so, yes." Poirot moved toward the window, gazing out at the snow-covered gardens. "Then observe with me, Inspector. The railway ticket, it bears yesterday's date. Yet the groundskeeper's schedule indicates he would have cleared the study's waste bin yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock. How does yesterday's ticket arrive in the safe chamber unless someone placed it deliberately this morning?" He turned sharply. "Where is this groundskeeper now?" Waverley consulted his notes with sudden uncertainty. He was dismissed 3 days ago. Sir Edmund mentioned budgetary concerns. Dismissed? Or did he resign? Poirot's eyebrow arched with meaningful precision. "And these servants who called in sick, their addresses were false, you said. But surely someone hired them. Surely someone knows their actual origins." Over the next hour, Poirot conducted brief interviews with each of the manor's guests, watching not their words but their reactions. When he asked Frederick Ashford about his recent gambling losses, the young man's pupils dilated slightly, and his fingers trembled as he reached for his coffee cup. When he inquired of Victor about his time in India, the brother-in-law's jaw tightened imperceptibly, and his eyes shifted toward the window, calculating, measuring. Most intriguing was his observation of Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor. When Poirot casually mentioned that the toys and spectacles bore dust patterns suggesting they'd been selected from specific locations within the manor, Pemberton's face went ashen. He excused himself abruptly, claiming sudden illness. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly as he watched the solicitor flee the room, "I suspect our thief is not someone who entered Ashford Manor. Our thief is someone who has resided within these walls for considerably longer than one night. The question, you understand, is not how they escaped. The question is why they left such peculiar evidence behind. Unless—" He paused, his fingers touching his moustache thoughtfully. "Unless someone wishes us to believe they did." The drawing-room had transformed into an unofficial interrogation chamber by midday. Poirot sat with surprising casualness in a velvet wingback chair, a small notebook resting on his knee, though he rarely consulted it. Instead, he listened with the patience of a confessor, allowing each guest to speak at length before asking his deceptively simple questions. Margaret Ashford was first, her narrative flowing with practiced smoothness. She described her evening routine with meticulous detail: dinner at 7, retiring to her chambers at 10, reading until midnight, when she decided to check on the safe, a habit born from nervous habit more than necessity. Yet when Poirot asked whether she had locked her bedroom door, she hesitated for precisely 2 seconds before answering affirmatively. A trivial detail, perhaps, but Poirot's eyes narrowed infinitesimally. Frederick Ashford's account contradicted his cousin's timeline. He claimed to have seen Margaret descending the main staircase at 11 o'clock, not retiring at 10 as she'd stated. When confronted with this discrepancy, Margaret's composure cracked briefly. She explained that she'd gone down for warm milk, forgotten in her initial shock, but her hands trembled as she spoke, and she avoided Poirot's gaze entirely. Victor's testimony proved equally troublesome. He insisted he'd been in the billiards room until 11:30, playing alone, a curious choice for a guest surrounded by family on Christmas Eve. Inspector Waverley confirmed that no one had seen him during that window of time. When Poirot asked why he preferred solitude on such an evening, Victor's response came too quickly, too rehearsed. I required contemplation regarding personal matters. And these personal matters, Poirot pressed gently, they involve considerable sums of money, perhaps? Your Indian ventures have not prospered as hoped? Victor's face flushed crimson. He admitted to financial difficulties, but vehemently denied any involvement in the theft. Yet his denial carried the texture of truth, spoken in service of a larger lie. A man protecting something beyond mere financial embarrassment. Miss Hartley, the elderly guest who had reported seeing the figure in the red coat, proved most curious. When asked to describe this phantom in red, she suddenly became vague, her initial certainty evaporating like morning mist. She stammered, retreated, ultimately admitted that perhaps she had been mistaken. Perhaps it had been merely shadows and Christmas punch affecting her perception. Poirot did not press her, but his fingers traced his moustache with deliberate slowness, a gesture suggesting deep thought. Mr. Pemberton, when finally located in his room, presented the most contradictory account of all. He claimed to have been asleep by 10 o'clock, having felt unwell throughout the evening. Yet a maid reported seeing him in the library at 11:15, studying documents by candlelight. When confronted, he fumbled through explanations about checking family records, about insomnia driving him downstairs, about the inconsistency being merely a misunderstanding. His nervous energy was palpable, his fingers perpetually adjusting his spectacles that, Poirot noted with interest, sat perfectly upon his nose. The servants presented their own peculiarities. The butler swore the library door had been locked until midnight, yet the key hung openly on a hook in the pantry. The housemaid claimed not to have entered that corridor all evening, but a speck of the distinctive yellow wax from the library candles clung to her sleeve. Each small contradiction might have been innocent alone, but together they wove a tapestry of deliberate obfuscation. As evening descended once more, Poirot requested that all guests remain within the manor. Inspector Waverley protested that surely someone would attempt to flee if guilty, but Poirot shook his head with certainty. None, Inspector. Our thief is not frightened. Our thief is confident. And confidence, you understand, is the luxury of those who believe they have already succeeded. He gazed toward the locked safe, then toward the scattered objects still arranged upon the desk, his expression suggesting he was reading an invisible message written in a language only he comprehended. The second evening of Christmas descended upon Ashford Manor with the weight of unresolved tension. Poirot had sequestered himself in the library with Inspector Waverley and Sir Edmund, demanding access to the family's financial records, correspondence, and legal documents. What emerged was a portrait of desperation painted across multiple canvases. Sir Edmund's textile empire, it transpired, stood on the precipice of catastrophic collapse. A railroad investment gone sour, combined with overextended credit lines, had consumed nearly 70% of his liquid assets. The jewels in the safe represented not merely sentimental value, but financial necessity, insurance against complete ruin. Margaret had discovered this truth only recently, which explained her midnight habit of checking the safe. She had been verifying that their security blanket remained intact, a talisman against approaching bankruptcy. Yet this dire circumstance created opportunity for multiple parties. Frederick's gambling debts amounted to nearly £3,000, a fortune for a young man without independent income. His creditors had begun making unpleasant inquiries. A theft orchestrated within the family would provide the perfect solution. Insurance claims would flow, the estate would recover temporarily, and his uncle's wealth could be quietly redistributed through familial obligation and sympathy. Victor's situation proved even more precarious. His Indian ventures had not merely failed, they had involved fraudulent investment schemes that threatened legal consequences. The letters recovered from his correspondence revealed desperate communications with a London solicitor, discussing strategies for avoiding prosecution through rapid asset liquidation. The jewels represented escape, a passage to the continent under an assumed identity, a second life purchased with stolen emeralds and sapphires. But Mr. Pemberton's motive cut deepest into the moral fabric of the situation. His personal fortune's disappearance was no accident, it was embezzlement. He had systematically misappropriated funds from client accounts, including substantial sums belonging to Sir Edmund himself. The discovery was imminent. An audit scheduled for December 27th would reveal everything. The stolen jewels were not his target for personal gain, but for restitution, a desperate attempt to replace a fraction of what he had stolen before his crimes surfaced. Three men with pressing motivations, Poirot observed, pacing before the fireplace while consulting his notebook. Yet the method remains theatrical. None? Why leave such peculiar objects? Why stage a mystery when simple theft would accomplish the goal? Inspector Waverley leaned forward. Perhaps to create confusion, to suggest it was an outsider? But we know no outsider entered this house, Poirot countered. The snow confirms this absolutely. No footprints disturb the pristine white, except those already documented. So our thief wishes us to believe something impossible, which means our thief wishes us to examine the impossible rather than the probable. Sir Edmund, who had sat silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke with dawning horror. You're suggesting one of them stole the jewels, not for themselves, but for another? As a favour, as leverage? Poirot's smile was thin as winter ice. I am suggesting, Sir Edmund, that the objects left behind are not misdirection, but confession. Consider. A playing card suggesting games of chance. A toy soldier indicating military service, spectacles broken, suggesting impaired vision or impaired judgment. A Christmas cracker torn open. A railway ticket to London. He paused, allowing the weight of connection to settle. Each object corresponds to a person. Each object tells a story. But the stories are not those we have heard in interview. They are the stories the thief wishes us to hear, not the truth of events, but the truth of motive. That night, Poirot requested that all household members gather once more. As they assembled in the drawing room, their faces bearing the exhaustion of scrutiny, the detective stood before them with an expression of absolute certainty. The theft was not committed for greed alone, he announced. It was committed for protection. And tomorrow morning, I shall explain precisely who protected whom, and why the Christmas heist was, in fact, an act of desperate love. The morning arrived with a development that seemed to crystallise the investigation into sudden, triumphant clarity. A servant, trembling with nervous energy, approached Inspector Waverley with damning evidence, a leather satchel discovered hidden in the wine cellar, containing nearly half of the stolen jewels. The bag bore Frederick Ashford's initials embossed in gold. Inspector Waverley's face brightened with the satisfaction of impending closure. He moved with decisive purpose toward Frederick, who sat pale and stricken in the drawing-room, and placed a restraining hand upon the young man's shoulder. "Frederick Ashford, I am placing you under arrest for the theft of the Ashford jewels. You have the right to remain silent." But Poirot, who had been studying the satchel with peculiar intensity, suddenly raised his hand. "Inspector, I must ask you to wait. This discovery troubles me greatly." Waverley's irritation was palpable. "Troubles you, Mr. Poirot?" "The evidence is conclusive. His initials are upon the bag. Stolen property was found in his possession. The motive is clear. His gambling debts. We have our thief. We have a convenient narrative," Poirot corrected gently, extending his hand for the satchel. He examined the leather carefully, running his fingers across the worn edges, the deliberately scratched corners, the initials themselves. His expression grew increasingly sceptical. "This satchel has been in the wine cellar for considerable time, months perhaps. Yet the theft occurred only yesterday evening. Tell me, Inspector, how does Frederick place stolen jewels in a bag that has rested undisturbed for seasons?" Frederick himself seemed paralysed between relief and confusion. He had not stolen anything. His stammered denials carried genuine bewilderment rather than guilty protestation. Yet the evidence against him appeared irrefutable. Poirot turned his gaze toward Mr. Pemberton, who had shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers adjusting his spectacles with increased frequency. The broken spectacles left upon the desk. Poirot said quietly, "They are not merely broken, they are deliberately broken. And they correspond, do they not, to a pair I observed in your possession during our interviews, Mr. Pemberton? The left lens has a particular scratch pattern." The solicitor's face drained of remaining colour. "But more interesting," Poirot continued, "is that Frederick's satchel bears dust patterns inconsistent with recent handling. Yet someone has very recently disturbed this cellar. The wine bottles near the satchel show evidence of recent movement. Inspector, I suspect someone placed this bag in Frederick's name deliberately, hoping to end our investigation prematurely." Waverley's confidence wavered. "Then who? If Pemberton is merely guilty of embezzlement, not theft." "Precisely the question," Poirot interjected. He began pacing, his fingers steepled before his lips. "Mr. Pemberton has motive to steal the jewels for restitution. Frederick has motive through desperation. But who among our guests has the capacity to orchestrate such an elaborate deception? Who possesses sufficient knowledge of the household secrets to manipulate the investigation itself?" Margaret Ashford, watching from her position near the window, suddenly rose to her feet. Her composure, so carefully maintained throughout the interrogations, cracked visibly. She moved toward the door with sudden purpose, but Poirot's voice stopped her cold. "Mrs. Ashford, your warm milk at 11 o'clock. You did not merely go downstairs for sustenance, did you? You went to meet someone. Someone who required your assistance in staging this theft." Margaret's face contorted with conflict, fear warring against maternal instinct. She remained silent, but her silence was itself a confession. "The real thief," Poirot announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, remains among us still, and they have just attempted to redirect our investigation toward an innocent man. Inspector, I suggest we examine not what was stolen, but who benefits most from our attention being diverted from the truth. The answer, I suspect, lies in understanding what Margaret Ashford would sacrifice her own reputation to protect. Margaret's resistance crumbled like ancient mortar beneath Poirot's relentless gaze. She sank back into her chair, her hands trembling as she reached for a handkerchief. When she finally spoke, her voice emerged barely above a whisper, carrying the weight of secrets harboured across years. "You must understand," she began, her eyes fixed upon the carpet rather than her interrogators. "Some secrets are kept not from malice, but from necessity. Some truths destroy more than they reveal." Poirot settled into a chair opposite her with patient attention. "Then reveal these truths to me, Mrs. Ashford. I suspect they trace their origins further back than Christmas Eve." Margaret took a trembling breath. 23 years prior, during the height of Edmund's textile prosperity, she had carried a child born of an indiscretion, a moment of weakness during her husband's extended absence in Manchester. The child, a daughter, had been given to a family in the countryside with sufficient funds to ensure her care and education. Edmund never knew. No one knew except Margaret and the solicitor who had arranged the confidential adoption. "She became a governess," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength through the weight of confession. "She has lived an honest, quiet life, entirely unaware of her true parentage. But 6 months ago, she fell gravely ill. The doctors demanded payment for specialised treatment, amounts beyond what her modest salary could provide. She wrote to me, believing herself to be writing to a distant benefactor whose name had been mentioned in her adoption papers. I recognised her handwriting immediately. My handwriting. My eyes staring back at me from her letters, Inspector Waverley leaned forward with dawning comprehension. "The girl! She is your daughter?" "My daughter," Margaret confirmed, "and Edmund's, though he remains entirely ignorant of this fact. The medical expenses accumulated to nearly £4,000. I could not access such sums without Edmund's knowledge, and I could not reveal the truth without shattering everything." Poirot's eyes narrowed with sudden understanding, but Mr. Pemberton knew of this arrangement. He was the solicitor involved in the original adoption. "Yes," Margaret whispered. "When he discovered his own crimes were about to be exposed, he approached me with a proposition. He would orchestrate the theft, remove the jewels, claim insurance fraud was involved, a scheme designed to create enough financial chaos that my withdrawal of funds for my daughter's medical care would remain unnoticed in the confusion. In exchange, I would help him access certain documents that would allow him to flee the country with sufficient capital." "A conspiracy of mutual benefit," Poirot observed, born from blackmail and desperation. "But the plan required accomplices with access to the safe." Margaret nodded miserably. "I provided the combination. I unlocked my bedroom door at the agreed time to allow Pemberton passage through the corridor. I created the disturbance with the milk to establish my presence away from the safe during the critical hours. But I did not know he intended to stage such an elaborate deception with those objects. Nor did I anticipate his plan to frame Frederick afterward." "A thief with conscience," Poirot mused, attempting to protect a daughter through association with a criminal. "But tell me, Mrs. Ashford, who suggested this scheme to Pemberton in the first place? Who possessed knowledge of both your daughter's existence and Pemberton's embezzlement simultaneously?" The drawing-room fell silent. Margaret's face went even paler, if such a thing were possible. Her gaze shifted toward the doorway where Miss Hartley, the elderly guest, stood observing the scene with unexpected intensity. "Miss Hartley is no stranger to this house," Poirot continued, his voice assuming the tone of irrefutable revelation. "Nor is she a mere guest invited for Christmas festivities. She was in fact Edmund's housekeeper during that period 23 years ago. She knows every secret these walls contain. She knew of Margaret's daughter. She knew of Pemberton's position and his access to confidential documents. And most importantly, Poirot turned toward the elderly woman with piercing clarity. She knew that her own granddaughter, Pemberton's daughter, born of an affair with the former housekeeper, was dying of the very same illness that afflicted Margaret's child. Miss Hartley's composure shattered like thin ice. "They are sisters," she said quietly. "My granddaughter. And Margaret's daughter. They never knew each other, never knew they shared blood. But the same disease runs through them both. Two innocent girls, connected by circumstance and by the sins of their parents." Was I wrong to attempt ensuring both could receive treatment? Poirot rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, his eyes moving from Miss Hartley to Margaret to the scattered objects still arranged upon the library desk. He approached the items with the reverence of an archaeologist examining ancient artefacts, pausing particularly at the toy soldier. Painted in garish red and gold, its uniform unmistakably that of the Indian Army. "Inspector Waverley," Poirot said without turning, "I require that you bring Mr. Victor Ashford to this room immediately. Tell him nothing, except that Monsieur Poirot wishes to conduct a final examination of the evidence." Waverley departed with visible confusion, and within moments Victor entered, his face bearing the exhausted pallor of a man whose secrets had begun their inevitable unravelling. Poirot did not acknowledge his arrival directly. Instead, he held the toy soldier aloft, studying it with theatrical precision. "This soldier," Poirot announced, his voice carrying the tone of casual observation rather than accusation, "is not merely a child's plaything. It is a specific regimental soldier, the Bengals, if I am not mistaken. Manufactured in London in 1901, sold exclusively through military specialty shops. Quite rare, quite distinctive." Victor's jaw tightened perceptibly. "I have been considering," Poirot continued, "the psychology of our thief. Here is a person willing to commit a serious crime, not for personal enrichment, but for the medical salvation of two innocent girls. Such a person would not randomly select objects for theatrical misdirection. Such a person would select objects laden with meaning, with personal significance, objects that tell a story to those who possess the key to interpret them." Poirot turned directly to Victor, his gaze penetrating. "This soldier belonged to you, did it not? You mentioned your time in India with considerable frequency, yet your financial circumstances suggest you departed that service under less than triumphant circumstances. Perhaps you were dismissed? Perhaps your conduct required you to leave hastily?" Victor's face flushed crimson. "That has nothing to do with." On the contrary, Poirot interrupted smoothly, "It has everything to do with the matter at hand. You see, I suspect you were acquainted with Mr. Pemberton's daughter during your service in India. Perhaps you were responsible for her circumstances, the circumstances that led to her abandonment and her illness. A debt unpaid, a responsibility shirked. When Miss Hartley recognised you among the Christmas guests, she saw opportunity for recompense." Victor's hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then explain," Poirot challenged, "why this toy soldier, your toy soldier given to you as a child, and carried throughout your military service, was discovered among the objects left by our thief. Explain why a man desperate to escape his financial circumstances would risk inclusion in a conspiracy designed not to benefit himself, but to benefit the illegitimate daughter he abandoned in Calcutta." The room seemed to contract around Victor's silence. Inspector Waverley watched with growing comprehension as the layers of deception peeled away like dead skin. Unless, Poirot continued with pitiless logic, the theft was never about theft at all, Unless it was Miss Hartley's method of bringing all the guilty parties together, the man who fathered Pemberton's daughter in moral weakness, the solicitor who embezzled funds meant for her care, the wife who had her own daughter and could afford to help while remaining silent. 4 interconnected lives, bound by sin and circumstance, all of whom benefited from the disruption and confusion the theft created. He gestured toward the toy soldier. You placed this deliberately, did you not? Not as misdirection, but as confession. You wanted to be known. You wanted the investigation to lead here, to this moment, where your daughter's existence could no longer remain hidden, where the truth of her parentage, the truth of your negligence, would finally demand reckoning. Victor's resistance crumbled, his face contorted with the violence of suppressed emotion, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the texture of a man whose conscience had been unbearably heavy for far too long. Yes, he whispered. Yes, I placed it there. I helped orchestrate this entire scheme. Not for money, for redemption. Victor's confession hung in the drawing room like smoke, dissipating slowly into an atmosphere already thick with betrayal and moral complexity. Inspector Waverley moved toward him with the automatic response of law enforcement, but Poirot raised a restraining hand once more. Inspector, before you make arrests, I must inform you that the situation has become considerably more intricate than a simple conspiracy. There remains a crucial matter unresolved, one that threatens to undermine the entire foundation of what we believe we have discovered. Even as he spoke, a disturbance erupted from the corridor outside. A servant's cry of alarm, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass and violent movement. Inspector Waverley rushed toward the commotion, Poirot following with surprising swiftness for a man of his years. What they discovered in the study was catastrophic. The safe, previously sealed and photographed, now bore evidence of frantic tampering. The remaining stolen jewels, the portion not recovered in Frederick's satchel, had vanished entirely. More troubling still, the scattered objects that had comprised the central evidence of their investigation lay destroyed. The playing card had been torn to confetti. The broken spectacles had been ground beneath a heel into unidentifiable fragments. The railway ticket had been set aflame, leaving only ash. The Christmas cracker lay crushed beyond recognition. Only the toy soldier remained, impossibly untouched amid the devastation. Someone knew, Poirot breathed, his usual composure fractured by genuine alarm. Someone understood that our conclusions were approaching dangerous territories. Someone among us feared what further investigation would reveal. Sir Edmund, who had rushed downstairs at the commotion, stood transfixed before the desecrated safe. The insurance adjuster arrives tomorrow morning, he said numbly. The remaining jewels were supposed to substantiate the claim. Without them, without the evidence, the theft becomes almost irrelevant, Poirot finished. Because the insurance claim cannot be processed without physical inventory, which means the conspiracy's financial foundation crumbles entirely. Whoever destroyed those jewels and that evidence understands that their elimination serves a dual purpose. It protects a secret far more valuable than the jewels themselves. Inspector Waverley's frustration boiled over. Mr. Poirot, you speak in riddles while evidence literally burns before us. We have confessions. We have motive. We should be making arrests, not philosophizing. And yet, Poirot countered sharply, we are missing the architect of this entire scheme. Miss Hartley orchestrated the initial conspiracy, yes. But she did not possess the access to destroy these jewels and evidence so thoroughly within minutes. She did not possess the knowledge required to determine precisely which objects held critical importance. Someone else, someone we have not adequately considered, moves within this household with the confidence of intimate familiarity. His gaze swept across the assembled gathering, Margaret pale and terrified, Victor broken and contemplative, Frederick, visibly innocent yet still suspect in the minds of many, Pemberton, whose embezzlement now seemed almost pedestrian compared to grander crimes, Miss Hartley, elderly and physically incapable of such violent destruction, Sir Edmund, devastated but. Poirot's eyes lingered here, not entirely surprised. The groundskeeper, Poirot said suddenly. The one dismissed 3 days prior. Inspector, you investigated his false address. But did you investigate why he was dismissed? Did you examine the actual reason Sir Edmund provided for his removal? Sir Edmund's face went ashen. That is a private matter between myself and your son? Poirot suggested quietly. Frederick, who inherited his father's household authority during his absence. Frederick, who might have possessed keys to the study, access to the safe's maintenance records, knowledge of the combination's previous iterations. Frederick, who might have orchestrated this entire affair not to conceal his gambling debts, but to protect someone infinitely more precious. Frederick's eyes widened in horrified recognition. The groundskeeper was not dismissed for incompetence, Poirot continued with merciless certainty. He was dismissed because he discovered something, perhaps photographs, perhaps letters, that revealed a relationship between himself and someone within this household. Someone whose identity, once revealed, would destroy far more than financial reputation. Someone whose secret was worth destroying evidence, worth committing additional crimes to protect. The toy soldier, miraculously preserved amid the destruction, seemed to glow with accusatory significance in the lamplight. Frederick's collapse came without warning. One moment he stood transfixed by Poirot's accusations, the next his body convulsed violently, his face contorting with agony as he clutched at his throat. His desperate gasps echoed through the study like the death rattle of some wounded animal, and within seconds he had fallen to the floor, his limbs thrashing with diminishing intensity. Poison, Inspector Waverley shouted, attempting to loosen Frederick's collar while simultaneously calling for medical assistance. But Poirot, observing the scene with clinical precision, recognised the futility of such efforts. The convulsions ceased within moments, Frederick's body becoming still and unnaturally rigid. The room descended into chaos. Margaret shrieked with maternal horror, though whether for her nephew or herself remained unclear. Sir Edmund stood frozen, his face the colour of old parchment. Miss Hartley made a move toward the door with surprising speed for a woman of her apparent age, but Inspector Waverley blocked her path with instinctive law enforcement reflex. "No one leaves this room," Waverley commanded, his earlier confusion replaced by the grim authority of a homicide investigator. "This is now a murder investigation." "Mr. Poirot." What just occurred? Poirot knelt beside Frederick's body, examining his lips and nostrils with meticulous care. Cyanide, most likely. Introduced into his body moments before his collapse. The question, Inspector, is not how it was administered, but by whom and when it was prepared. His eyes moved deliberately toward the water glass that sat upon the desk, the very desk where the destroyed evidence had been scattered. The glass was 3/4 empty, lipstick marks visible upon its rim. Frederick's lipstick marks, though Frederick was unmistakably male. Someone anticipated that young Mr. Ashford would require refreshment during this interrogation, Poirot observed. Someone prepared that glass knowing that accusation and stress would drive him to drink. Someone, in short, who understood that Frederick possessed knowledge dangerous to their survival. Margaret lunged toward her nephew's body, but Inspector Waverley caught her firmly. "Mrs. Ashford, step away from the deceased." "Mr. Poirot, I require your assessment of who could have poisoned that water glass. Almost anyone, Poirot replied grimly. It was placed upon the desk this morning, visible to all who entered this study, but more importantly, it was placed by someone confident that Frederick would be the one to drink from it. Someone who knew his habits, his responses to stress, his likely behaviour during interrogation. Victor suddenly spoke, his voice hollow. The groundskeeper, he was my friend. We served together in India. He came to Ashford Manor seeking temporary work, seeking to understand why I had abandoned his sister to such a fate. Sir Edmund dismissed him not because Frederick discovered their relationship, but because the groundskeeper confronted him directly about my negligence, my cruelty, my absolute indifference to the consequences of my actions. And Frederick? Poirot pressed. Frederick protected me, Victor continued. He helped the groundskeeper disappear, provided him funds, arranged passage to the continent. He was my ally, my conscience made manifest. He was the one person in this household who understood that some debts transcend financial accounting. Poirot's expression shifted into something resembling profound sadness. Then Frederick became a liability. He knew too much about too many conspiracies. He understood the web of deception, the network of hidden relationships, the dangerous knowledge that could topple reputations and destroy lives. And someone within this room determined that his silence was preferable to his eventual testimony. Inspector Waverley drew his revolver with deliberate precision. Everyone remain absolutely still. This is now a murder investigation involving multiple parties. No one leaves this room until I determine who administered the poison. But Poirot held up a hand, his gaze fixed upon the doorway where a figure had appeared, the physician summoned to examine Frederick's body. The doctor stood motionless, his medical bag open, his hand trembling as he observed the scene before him. "Dr. Ashford," Poirot said quietly, using a name no one had previously mentioned in the investigation, Sir Edmund's legitimate physician and, unless I am gravely mistaken, his illegitimate son. The groundskeeper was not searching for work but for his brother, the man who knew precisely how to administer cyanide without detection, the man who understood medical science sufficiently to ensure swift death without arousing immediate suspicion. The doctor's hand moved toward his pocket. Inspector Waverley's revolver rose immediately, but not before Poirot understood the terrible truth. The investigation had not prevented another crime. It had merely precipitated one already planned, already inevitable. The revolver's hammer clicked back with lethal finality, yet Dr. Ashford did not withdraw his hand from his pocket. Instead, he smiled, a terrible, broken smile that spoke of years of suppressed rage and carefully constructed facades crumbling into dust. "You have been remarkably thorough, Monsieur Poirot," the doctor said, his voice carrying the peculiar calm of a man who had surrendered to inevitability. "But you have missed the central pattern that binds all these fractured pieces together. You have examined the symptoms while ignoring the disease itself." Poirot's eyes narrowed with sudden, piercing comprehension. His gaze swept backward through the investigation, through every statement, every object, every carefully constructed deception, and in that moment of mental reconstruction, the pattern emerged, not as a sudden revelation, but as an inexorable logic that had been present from the investigation's inception. "The spectacles," Poirot breathed. "The broken spectacles left among the evidence. I assumed they belonged to Mr. Pemberton, but they did not. They belong to you. You require spectacles for your medical work, yet you have been observing this entire investigation without them. You broke them deliberately, understanding that Pemberton would accept blame for their destruction. You placed them there as confession and misdirection simultaneously." "Very good," Dr. Ashford acknowledged. But the pattern extends far deeper. Consider the Christmas cracker, the child's toy soldier, the railway ticket. Each object represents not a person, but a moment of abandonment. The cracker represents festive joy denied to illegitimate children. The soldier represents military service that could not redeem my father's sins. The ticket represents escape, the journey I planned to take with my sister once the conspiracy had concluded and sufficient funds had been secured. Inspector Waverley maintained his weapon's steady aim. "Doctor, remove your hand from your pocket slowly."
We have identified you as the murderer of Frederick Ashford. Anything you attempt will result in immediate force.
But that is where Monsieur Poirot's pattern recognition exceeds your understanding, the doctor continued, ignoring Waverley's command. Frederick's murder was not a crime of passion or desperation. It was an act of mercy. Frederick knew too much about my sister's relationship with the groundskeeper, too much about my father's illegitimate children, scattered across continents like seeds blown by careless wind. He would have eventually testified, eventually revealed that Sir Edmund Ashford fathered at least 7 children outside his marriage, distributing wealth and ruin with equal indifference across multiple nations. Poirot raised a hand to silence Waverley's imminent interruption. "Continue, Doctor. The pattern requires completion." "The jewels were never the objective," Dr. Ashford explained, his hand finally withdrawing from his pocket empty. A gesture of theatrical surrender that somehow felt more threatening than violence itself. They were merely the mechanism through which I could orchestrate a gathering of all the guilty parties. Miss Hartley, who knew my mother was the housekeeper dismissed when she became pregnant. Pemberton, who facilitated my father's systematic abandonment of his illegitimate children through legal machinations. Victor, who knowingly seduced and abandoned my sister in India. Margaret, who possessed resources to help while remaining deliberately ignorant. And Frederick, who protected them all with the silence of family loyalty. The doctor's eyes fixed upon Sir Edmund with burning intensity. My father created us, created me, created my sister, created the groundskeeper's brother, and then attempted to erase us from existence through calculated neglect. The theft was designed to force confession, to expose the network of sin and complicity that had sustained his empire. I orchestrated every element, the locked room, the peculiar objects, the false leads. I knew exactly how you would investigate, Monsieur Poirot, because I have studied your methods for years. You intended Frederick's death from the beginning, Poirot realised, not as a crime of opportunity, but as a predetermined necessity. He was the keystone in your elaborate structure. With his death, the investigation becomes paralysed. With his death, attention shifts from the conspiracy's deeper implications to immediate murder investigation. Precisely, Dr. Ashford confirmed. Frederick was kind to my sister when the world was cruel. Frederick protected those of us born of sin when society demanded we disappear. But his kindness made him weak. His protection made him vulnerable, and his eventual testimony would have destroyed the very people he sought to shield. Sir Edmund finally spoke, his voice reduced to a whisper. "You are my son. I never knew. You never cared to know," Dr. Ashford interrupted coldly. "That is the pattern, Father, not the crimes themselves, but the deliberate cultivation of ignorance, the systematic erasure of responsibility. And now that pattern extends into murder, into the complete inversion of the moral order you constructed. The thief is revealed as an instrument of justice. The murderer stands before you as an instrument of retribution, and Christmas Eve becomes the moment when your carefully hidden world collapses into truth. Inspector Waverley moved forward to secure the doctor's person, but Poirot remained motionless, his expression suggesting he had perceived something in this confession that transcended the immediate moment of arrest. As Inspector Waverley secured restraints upon Dr. Ashford's wrists, Poirot remained transfixed, his gaze travelling methodically across each face in the room, Margaret's tear-stained features, Victor's expression of hollow understanding, Miss Hartley's ancient eyes that seemed to contain the accumulated sorrow of decades, and finally Sir Edmund, whose face had transformed into a mask of something approaching revelation. "No," Poirot said quietly, his hand rising once more to halt Waverley's proceedings. "Inspector, before you remove the doctor, I must understand something that troubles me deeply. Dr. Ashford, you speak of your sister's abandonment in India, yet your investigation into your father's illegitimate children suggests considerably more than casual discovery. How did you identify all of them? How did you trace their individual circumstances with such precision?" Dr. Ashford's expression shifted into something resembling pride, the pride of a craftsman observing recognition of his meticulous work. "I became a physician, partly through necessity, partly through design. Medical records are remarkably accessible to those with credentials and determination. Birth certificates filed under false names, hospital admissions, death certificates. My father's pattern of seduction was consistent enough that once I understood it, I could reconstruct his entire legacy of abandoned children. And your sister?" Poirot pressed. "The one who contracted the same illness as Margaret's daughter? Tell me truthfully, Doctor, was she truly abandoned in India, or was her illness perhaps more recently acquired?" The doctor's composure fractured momentarily. "She was abandoned. She has suffered. The illness is real." "I do not dispute the illness," Poirot replied. "I dispute the timeline. You see, I have been examining the medical treatment costs that motivated this entire conspiracy. The £4,000 that drove Margaret into complicity, that drove Pemberton into desperate action. But such specialised medical treatment for two young women, requiring payment simultaneously, suggests something rather more specific than mere coincidence." He turned towards Sir Edmund. "Tell me, Sir Edmund, when did you first become aware that your legitimate son had fathered an illegitimate child? When did you discover that Dr. Ashford was not merely the family physician, but your grandson?" The revelation struck the room with the force of physical violence. Margaret's hand covered her mouth. Victor's face drained of remaining colour. Miss Hartley's ancient eyes widened with comprehension of a deception far more intimate than any previously imagined. "My God," Sir Edmund breathed. "The groundskeeper was your grandson," Poirot confirmed, "born of Dr. Ashford's brief union with the groundskeeper's sister in India. Not merely an abandoned child, but a child whose existence created a generational echo of your own sins. Dr. Ashford did not merely hate you for your negligence toward his mother and himself. He hated you for perpetuating a cycle of abandonment that had now extended into the generation he himself had created." The doctor's silence confirmed the devastating accuracy of this assessment. "The medical expenses were therefore not for two separate patients," Poirot continued with relentless logic, "but for three. Your illegitimate grandson, your sister, and the child born of that relationship. A complete replication of your father's crimes, but this time with full awareness, with deliberate comprehension of the moral destruction such abandonment creates. You did not merely investigate your father's sins, you reproduced them, and then you used your own victims as instruments of investigation and retribution." Dr. Ashford's face contorted with anguished fury. "Do you understand what it means to be born of sin? To exist as a walking reminder of your father's lustful weakness? To be denied inheritance, denied recognition, denied even the basic acknowledgement of your paternity? I became a physician to heal, but I discovered that the only healing possible required exposure, required destruction, required that everyone in this household understand that their comfortable ignorance had consequences measured in human suffering. And Frederick? Poirot asked quietly. Why did he require death? Because he loved me, the doctor whispered. Because his love was predicated upon ignorance of what I had become. Because his innocence would have eventually crumbled into judgment. And I could not bear to witness the moment when protection transformed into condemnation. Better to silence him than to watch his face as he understood that the man he had sheltered had become the very thing he had despised, a murderer, a orchestrator of destruction, a victim who had transformed himself into perpetrator. Inspector Waverley led the doctor from the room, but Poirot remained motionless, comprehending at last that this crime had never been about jewels or insurance fraud, or even the exposure of moral corruption. It had been about the desperate attempt of a man to extract acknowledgement of his existence from a father incapable of love, through the only language such a man understood, violence and truth. The drawing-room fell into profound silence once Dr. Ashford's form had disappeared through the doorway, guided by Inspector Waverley's steady hand. Yet Poirot made no move to follow. Instead, he walked deliberately toward the Christmas tree that stood in the corner of the room, its lights casting flickering shadows across the gathered conspirators. He reached beneath the lower branches and withdrew a small, wrapped package, bearing no name, no tag, no indication of intended recipient. "Inspector Waverley," Poirot called, his voice carrying a peculiar urgency. "Before you complete the doctor's arrest, I must insist upon opening this package in your presence. For I suspect it contains evidence that renders the entire investigation fundamentally incomplete." Waverley reappeared, his hand still resting upon Dr. Ashford's shoulder, confusion evident upon his weathered features. "Mr. Poirot, we have our murderer. We have motive, means and opportunity. What possible evidence could—" "Please," Poirot interrupted gently, already carefully unwrapping the paper with the precision of an archaeologist uncovering ancient artefacts. Beneath the wrapping lay a leather journal, its pages worn from frequent consultation. The first entry bore a date from 3 years prior, written in the careful, measured script of medical training. Poirot opened to a marked page and read aloud, "Father returned to the manor today. I watched him from the study window, observing the manner in which he moved through the grounds as though he owned not merely the physical property, but the very air surrounding it. He did not see me. He never sees me. I have decided that invisibility is my inheritance, and invisibility shall become my weapon." Sir Edmund made a choking sound, his hand rising to his throat as though physically restraining words that threatened to escape. Margaret moved toward him instinctively, but her own guilt seemed to paralyse her movements midway, leaving her suspended in a gesture of incomplete comfort. "The journal is not merely a record," Poirot continued, turning pages with theatrical deliberation, "but a meticulous planning document. Here, 3 months ago, we find the initial conception of the Christmas Heist scheme. Here, 2 months prior, the identification of Miss Hartley as a potential accomplice. Here, 1 month previous, the systematic documentation of each guest's vulnerabilities, each person's secrets, each potential lever for manipulation." He paused, his eyes finding Dr. Ashford's face with devastating precision. "But what fascinates me most profoundly is this entry, dated precisely 1 week ago. The doctor writes, Frederick has begun to suspect. His questions regarding the groundskeeper's departure have become increasingly pointed. I must determine whether his suspicion derives from genuine moral concern or from the protective instinct of a man guarding family secrets. If the former, he becomes an ally. If the latter, he becomes an obstacle requiring removal. "You knew," Poirot said, his voice dropping to barely audible intensity. "You knew that Frederick's death was not inevitable but conditional. You were prepared to allow him to live if his investigation served your purposes, and prepared to eliminate him if it threatened them. This was not a crime of passion or even of premeditated vengeance. This was a crime of surgical calculation, executed with the precision of a man who had spent years perfecting the mechanics of manipulation." Dr. Ashford attempted to lunge toward the journal, but Waverley's grip tightened with anticipatory force. "Don't," the inspector commanded, his revolver rising with renewed focus. "You've already demonstrated your capacity for murder. I will not hesitate to prevent a second offence." "There is a final entry," Poirot said quietly, directing his attention back to the journal's later pages. "Written last night, after the theft had been successfully executed but before Frederick's collapse. The doctor writes, 'Tomorrow I will observe the detective's investigation with profound interest. He will examine the evidence I have so carefully arranged. He will interview the witnesses I have so thoroughly prepared, and he will believe himself to be discovering truth, when in fact he will be following the narrative I have constructed for his consumption. Every clue is deliberate. Every misdirection is calculated. Every revelation will confirm the story I have chosen to tell. Frederick will die not because he knows too much, but because his death serves as the capstone to my design, proof that even an innocent man within this conspiracy must suffer the consequences of his father's sins." Inspector Waverley's face went ashen. "You planned this from the beginning. You orchestrated every element specifically to ensure that the investigation would conclude with your arrest, your confession, and the complete exposure of your father's moral bankruptcy." "I planned to end my invisibility," Dr. Ashford responded, his voice hollow but determined. "I planned to force acknowledgement. I planned to transform the erasure of my existence into a truth so overwhelming that my father could never again pretend his illegitimate children did not exist. And I succeeded, did I not? Every person in this room now comprehends the full weight of what I am, what I have done, and why I have done it. I am no longer invisible. I am unforgettable." Poirot closed the journal slowly, his expression reflecting something approaching sorrow. "You are unforgettable," he acknowledged, "but you are also imprisoned, not merely by law, but by your own design. You have won your confrontation with your father through the only language he could comprehend, the language of violence, destruction, and scandal. But victory purchased at such a price is indistinguishable from defeat." As Inspector Waverley began escorting Dr. Ashford toward the door for the final time, Poirot's voice emerged with sudden, cutting clarity, a sound so unexpected in its authority that everyone froze mid-motion. "Inspector, halt immediately. I must revise my assessment of this entire affair." Waverley turned, his patience visibly exhausted. "Mr. Poirot, we have solved the crime. We have identified the murderer, recovered the confession, examined the planning documents. What possible revision could—" "The journal," Poirot interrupted, his eyes scanning its pages with renewed intensity. "Inspector, examine the handwriting carefully. Compare it to the entries dated within the past week. Notice the inconsistency? The pressure of the pen changes. The script itself evolves. These final entries were not written by Dr. Ashford. The room's atmosphere shifted with palpable violence. Sir Edmund's face transformed from anguish into something resembling frozen terror. Margaret's hand trembled as it rose to her lips. Miss Hartley, the elderly woman who had seemed so peripheral to the investigation's core mechanisms, slowly straightened in her chair with a posture suggesting considerably less infirmity than her previous demeanour had suggested. "You cannot be serious," Dr. Ashford protested, his voice carrying genuine confusion. "I wrote every entry. I planned every detail." "No," Poirot said with absolute certainty. "You were the instrument, but not the architect. Someone far more intelligent, far more patient, utilised your rage and your desire for revenge as a mechanism through which to accomplish objectives entirely distinct from your own. Someone who understood your psychology so thoroughly that they could predict your every action, manipulate your every decision, and ultimately ensure your arrest while maintaining their own absolute invisibility." His gaze swept toward Miss Hartley with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "The housekeeper. The woman who witnessed your birth, who observed your mother's dismissal, who understood from the very beginning that Sir Edmund's moral bankruptcy extended across generations. You have orchestrated this entire affair, have you not? Using Dr. Ashford's legitimate rage as cover for objectives far more calculated, far more ruthless, far more comprehensively devastating." Miss Hartley's composure, which had remained unshaken throughout the investigation, finally cracked. But the crack revealed not guilt or fear, but something approaching grim satisfaction. She rose slowly, her movement suddenly fluid and purposeful, the physical limitations of age seeming to evaporate like morning mist. 30 years, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated decades. 30 years I remained in this household, invisible in precisely the manner the good doctor believes himself to be. 30 years watching Sir Edmund seduce housemaids, govern mistresses, distribute his destructive affections across continents, and 30 years waiting for the mechanism through which his empire would collapse from internal contradiction. You seduced Dr. Ashford into conspiracy, Poirot realised aloud. You provided him with the initial information regarding his father's other children. You suggested the theft. You recommended the specific objects for the scene. You orchestrated every element of this investigation, ensuring that the truth would emerge not as isolated scandal, but as systematic exposure of generational moral corruption. "And the journal entries?" Inspector Waverley demanded, his weapon rising with renewed focus. "Fabricated," Poirot answered. "Written by Miss Hartley herself, in deliberate imitation of the doctor's handwriting. She required that Dr. Ashford appear to be a calculating mastermind rather than a victim of manipulation. She required that his arrest seem like the conclusion rather than merely one movement in a larger symphony of vengeance." Miss Hartley smiled, and in that smile resided something both terrifying and pitiable, the expression of a woman who had invested her entire existence in the cultivation of revenge. "My daughter," she said simply. "Sir Edmund's illegitimate daughter, not the one in India. The one who worked in this very household as a chambermaid, dismissed when her pregnancy became evident. She died bearing his child. Died because he refused to provide the medical care that might have saved her life. Died because the cost of her survival was less important than the preservation of his reputation." Sir Edmund's collapse was total. He sank into the nearest chair, his body convulsing with sobs that seemed to emerge from some unfathomable depth of belated comprehension. "Dr. Ashford's rage was genuine," Miss Hartley continued, her voice carrying the texture of confession. "But it was also convenient. I merely gave it direction. I merely ensured that his desire for acknowledgement would result not in personal catharsis, but in comprehensive destruction of the man responsible for his existence." Poirot's expression reflected something beyond mere intellectual satisfaction, a recognition of how thoroughly human motivation could transcend individual motive, how revenge could be woven so intricately into the fabric of investigation that even a detective of his acumen required the final moment to perceive the full architecture of deception. "Inspector," he said quietly, "you now have 2 criminals to arrest, and the case that appeared to conclude with surgical certainty has instead opened into far more troubling territories." The constables arrived within the hour, their motorcars pulling into Ashford Manor's snow-covered drive with the finality of judgment rendered inevitable. Yet as they prepared to secure both Dr. Ashford and Miss Hartley, Poirot requested a final assembly in the library, a gathering that Inspector Waverley, despite his professional inclination toward closure, recognised as necessary for the narrative to achieve proper resolution. Before we conclude, Poirot addressed the assembled group with the tone of a lecturer concluding a particularly complex theorem. "I must articulate the complete architecture of deception, for it extends far beyond what the surface investigation revealed. You see, the clues were always present, we merely failed to interpret them correctly." He gestured toward the still scattered remnants of the destroyed evidence. The spectacles bearing Mr. Pemberton's apparent guilt, broken deliberately to suggest his involvement while simultaneously protecting Miss Hartley's true role. The railway ticket dated 3 days prior, not evidence of the thief's planning, but evidence of Miss Hartley's own journey to London, where she consulted with legal documents regarding her daughter's estate and the disposition of Sir Edmund's assets. Moving toward the window, Poirot continued his exposition. The toy soldier represented not merely Victor's Indian service, but Miss Hartley's own research into the various illegitimate children. She had studied them all, documented them all, understood their circumstances with the precision of someone conducting a genealogical investigation. The Christmas cracker symbolised the festive joy denied to those born outside matrimony. Every object was curated, every object told a story, but the stories were narrated by Miss Hartley, not by Dr. Ashford. Margaret, who sat rigid in her chair, finally spoke with trembling uncertainty. But if Miss Hartley orchestrated this entire affair, what was her objective? The theft itself, the jewels that vanished, were never the objective, Poirot confirmed. The objective was exposure. Miss Hartley required that every person in this household, every conspirator, every complicit observer, every person who had benefited from Sir Edmund's systematic abandonment of his illegitimate children, understand the full weight of their moral culpability. The theft was merely the mechanism through which truth could be extracted and displayed. He turned toward Miss Hartley with an expression reflecting both condemnation and reluctant admiration. "You orchestrated Dr. Ashford's conspiracy, knowing that his actions would ultimately expose not merely your daughter's death, but the entire network of abandonment and negligence. You anticipated that he would confess, that his confession would lead investigators toward the deeper truths, and that those truths would culminate in the revelation of your own involvement. You were willing to accept imprisonment, because your imprisonment would serve as permanent testimony to Sir Edmund's crimes. But there remains one final complication," Poirot continued, his voice dropping to barely audible intensity. "The question of Frederick Ashford's murder. Dr. Ashford administers the poison, yes, but the poison itself, the cyanide, was not obtained through his medical credentials. The compound was specifically formulated, specifically prepared, with a concentration far exceeding what medical practice would typically require. This level of precision suggests not merely murderous intent, but the involvement of someone possessing considerable knowledge of chemical processes." His gaze fixed upon Victor with devastating certainty. "You provided the poison, did you not? You, who served in India with access to restricted compounds, who possessed the chemical knowledge and the practical experience to create precisely what was required. You participated not in the theft, but in the murder, understanding that Frederick's death would serve Miss Hartley's ultimate objective, the complete destruction of this household's moral foundation." Victor's silence confirmed the accuracy of this accusation. He did not attempt denial or justification, merely sat with the posture of a man who had accepted the inevitability of his own destruction. The truly tragic element, Poirot reflected, addressing the room with the weariness of a man who has witnessed human corruption reach its comprehensive apex, is that Dr. Ashford's original objective, the exposure of his father's systemic cruelty, required only the theft itself. The investigation, properly conducted, would have revealed everything. But Miss Hartley required more. She required blood. She required that Frederick, who had protected Dr. Ashford with familial loyalty, become a sacrificial offering to her vendetta. Inspector Waverley stepped forward with renewed authority. Dr. Ashford, Victor Ashford, and Miss Hartley, you are all under arrest for conspiracy, theft, and murder. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say may be used against you in legal proceedings. As the constables secured restraints and prepared to transport the accused toward holding cells, Poirot approached Sir Edmund, who remained collapsed in his chair like a man whose internal scaffolding had been entirely dismantled. Your empire, Sir Edmund, Poirot said quietly, is built upon the systematic erasure of human consequence. Your children exist, yet you have refused to acknowledge them. Your actions reverberate across generations, yet you have insisted upon their irrelevance. Justice, in its various forms, has finally arrived at your doorstep. Whether it arrives in the form of legal consequences for your co-conspirators, or in the form of personal reckoning for your moral bankruptcy, remains a matter between yourself and your conscience. But the invisibility you have granted to your sins has been permanently illuminated. The Christmas season that had begun with a glittering theft concluded with the comprehensive exposure of moral corruption that no locked safe could have contained. The constables had departed with their prisoners by late evening on Boxing Day, their motor cars disappearing into the snow-laden darkness, with the finality of judgment rendered and accepted. Inspector Waverley remained behind, attending to final documentation and the securing of evidence, while Poirot stood alone in the library, examining the recovered jewels that had been discovered in Frederick's satchel, the portion of the theft that had not been destroyed in the subsequent chaos. He held each piece to the lamplight with meticulous care, observing the quality of the gems, the precision of their settings, the manner in which they caught and refracted illumination. Yet as he studied a particular emerald brooch, a piece that had belonged to Sir Edmund's grandmother according to the family inventory, something peculiar registered in his perception. The setting bore microscopic scratches inconsistent with natural age. The gemstone itself, while authentic, had been replaced within its mounting at some point considerably more recent than the brooch's original creation. Poirot's eyes narrowed with the dawning recognition that something remained fundamentally unresolved within the investigation's architecture. He moved toward the safe, examining the lock mechanism with renewed scrutiny. Inspector Waverley emerged from his documentation to observe the detective's sudden activity with visible confusion. "Mr. Poirot, we have resolved the case. The perpetrators have been apprehended, surely." "The safe's lock bears evidence of recent manipulation," Poirot interrupted, his fingers tracing the mechanism's intricate components, "but not the kind of manipulation consistent with the theft itself. This damage is far more recent, far more purposeful. It suggests that someone accessed the safe after the initial theft occurred, after the investigation had begun, after the conspiracy had been ostensibly exposed." Waverley's professional patience began to fray. "Are you suggesting another theft? Another conspiracy?" "We have confessions. We have evidence. We have confessions to what Miss Hartley orchestrated," Poirot corrected carefully. "But we do not have confession to the modification of these jewels, nor to the subsequent manipulation of the safe mechanism. Someone within this household possessed knowledge of the theft's execution and utilised that knowledge to accomplish a secondary objective entirely distinct from Miss Hartley's vendetta." He held the emerald brooch toward the lamplight once more, permitting it to rotate slowly. Engraved within the gold mounting, visible only to one studying with exceptional care, were initials, not those of the original owner, but those of Margaret Ashford. The implications settled across the room like winter fog, obscuring certainty and introducing fresh questions into what had appeared to be conclusively resolved. Margaret Poirot called quietly, requesting her presence in the library. When she appeared moments later, her expression bore the exhaustion of a woman who believed all revelations had concluded and all judgments had been rendered. She found herself confronted with the brooch held between Poirot's fastidious fingers. Her face transformed, not into guilt precisely, but into something more complex, a recognition that her own role in the evening's events extended beyond what she had confessed. The jewels were not merely stolen and then recovered, Poirot stated with absolute certainty. They were stolen, partially recovered by Miss Hartley's design, and then selectively replaced with substitutions. Excellent substitutions, mind you, substitutes that would deceive even professional assessment, but substitutes nonetheless. And you, Mrs. Ashford, orchestrated this final deception. Margaret's hands trembled as she sank into a nearby chair. My daughter, she whispered. The medical expenses were genuine, but the amount required was far less than I confessed to needing. The additional funds, the difference between what I actually required and what I claimed to require, I utilised to purchase replacement gems. Stones of exceptional quality but lesser value than the originals. I intended to substitute them gradually, systematically transferring genuine wealth from the estate to my daughter's medical fund, while maintaining the appearance of the family fortune remaining intact. But when the theft occurred, Poirot concluded, your carefully planned systematic theft became overshadowed by Miss Hartley's more dramatic conspiracy. You perceived opportunity. You utilised the chaos of investigation to complete substitutions that might otherwise have required months or years to accomplish undetected. Inspector Waverley made a move toward Margaret, but Poirot raised a restraining hand. Inspector, I suspect Mrs. Ashford's crimes, while technically constituting theft, derive from motivations sufficiently sympathetic that the Crown may wish to consider leniency. A mother attempting to secure medical treatment for her abandoned daughter, such crimes occupy a peculiar moral territory. Do they not? The detective turned toward Margaret with expression reflecting neither condemnation nor absolution, merely acknowledgement. Yet this discovery introduces a troubling element to our resolution. If Margaret perpetrated a secondary theft utilising the cover of Miss Hartley's conspiracy, what prevents us from postulating that other conspiracies, other objectives, other crimes remain undetected within the layers of this investigation? He moved toward the window, gazing out at the snow-covered gardens where fresh powder had obscured all previous footprints, all evidence of prior movement. The Christmas heist, we have concluded, involved theft, murder, elaborate conspiracy, and systematic manipulation across multiple generations. Yet standing here, examining the physical evidence of crimes within crimes, I am compelled to wonder, what remains hidden? What truth has been buried so deeply beneath layers of deception that even the most thorough investigation cannot excavate it? Inspector Waverley, thoroughly exhausted by implication and suggestion, could only regard the detective with weary resignation. Yet Poirot's expression suggested his mind continued its relentless operation, perceiving patterns and connections that transcended the immediate case. The mystery concludes. Poirot announced quietly, yet mysteries, I have discovered, possess a tendency toward perpetuation. They spawn like winter fog, dissipate momentarily, only to reconstitute in forms increasingly difficult to perceive. This case is resolved. Yet somewhere in the depths of Ashford Manor, I suspect, another mystery awaits discovery. One that will require considerably more than Hercule Poirot's methods to properly illuminate,